Hi, I'm Pastor Clark. This is a Bible study on Matthew chapter 9 and chapter 10. It's a little section that's right at the hinge of those verses. I'm not doing it live today. Um, I'm actually going to get tested for COVID. I don't have any symptoms. It's just a precautionary measure. I do have a history of asthma, so that puts me in a bit of a higher risk category, and I think is one of the reasons why I qualified. So um, I'll let you know how it goes. I hear it's uncomfortable. So yeah. Well, let's dive into this Bible study. As always, I sort of trust that the spirits will lead us to make connections between our lives and the life of the world and the scriptures. Well, obviously, we're still in pandemic mode. We've also seen protests across the country, and just last night, the city council of Minneapolis pledged to dismantle the police and create a new public safety thing. I don't know what that means, but obviously a lot is changing, and so given those realities, we come to Scripture looking for how Christ invites us to be in the world and hold our hearts and our neighbors. Okay, so here we go. Matthew 9, 35, 10, 8. So some opening kind of summary statements. It is that this itself is a summary statement. It kind of, in terms of, don't worry about the chapter and verse markings or the headings that are in your Bible. Those are all added later. Originally, so in just reading it, you will see the original author's kind of way of organizing the material. And so Matthew, like a lot of the other gospels, they have these kind of summary statements of what Jesus and the disciples have been up to. And that might be repeated 3 or 4 times throughout the gospel. And so you see at each of these summary statements, it's kind of like a new section in the gospel. So here in Matthew, this section of verses here at the end of chapter 9 really echo and kind of mimic some other verses at the end of chapter 4. At the end of chapter 4, it sort of introduces the Sermon on the Mount. So there's the kind of hinge that moves into the next section, the Sermon on the Mount. Here at the end of chapter 9, it ends the section of Jesus's ministry, his miracles, and inaugurates what is Jesus's kind of missionary efforts, his teaching and activity, into now the disciples' activity. They're also proclaiming the good news and performing miracles and cures and things. And so there's kind of this organization to Matthew that really doesn't have to do with chronology so much as what Matthew wants us to see about the mission of Jesus. And so we have all Jesus's teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, and then we have a bunch of Jesus's miracles, and then Jesus sends the disciples to do exactly what Jesus just did, both his teaching and his healings and miracles and things. And then, after that, we move into the next section. But there's kind of this Jesus does, the disciples watch, then Jesus sends the disciples, so they do, and Jesus watches in a sense. Jesus multiplies his ministry, and the ministry of the disciples is exactly based on the ministry of Jesus. All right, there it is, summary statement here. Okay, of what's going on here. So here that is. Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and curing every disease and sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them, because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. So there you go. In one sentence, right off the bat, is just, here's what Jesus was doing. That's a summary statement. And then, verse 36 sticks out to me, because they were harassed and helpless like a sheep without a shepherd. This describes why Jesus had compassion on them, that Jesus is ministering to crowds. This is a large public ministry. It's not a private endeavor, but a public one. I just heard about a study that was done. A researcher took mice, research mice, whatever, and put them into two groups. There was nothing different about the two groups. But then he had two groups of assistants, and he told one group of assistants, you're going to be caring for the smart mice. And the other group of assistants, he said, you're going to be caring for the dumb mice. Now, again, there's nothing different about the mice. He's just priming the assistants by saying this group is smart, this group is dumb. And then the assistants had, a lot of the, lab mice kind of things to do, caring for them, watching them run mazes, timing them on their completion of those mazes and stuff like that. And after it was all said and done, what was found was that the smart mice performed better, quote unquote smart, right? There's nothing different about these mice. And then the dumb mice performed badly. And the reason why is because of how the assistants treated the mice. Okay? So the folks in the assistants with the so-called smart mice treated them well, expected them to do well, and cared for them in a way that supported their success. While the other group of assistants didn't give their mice the same level of care. And so those mice underperformed. And so the kind of interpretation of these results is that what we expect out of others, including animals, other humans as well, what we expect out of others, what we assume about others, is what we will get from them. Right? Okay, does that make any sense? So I remembered that, hearing about that study, in the way that Jesus looked at these crowds. He saw that the crowds were harassed and helpless. That's an external reality. That's not an internal reality. He didn't look at them and say there's something wrong with these people, that they are to blame for their circumstances. No, he looked at them and said there's all kinds of external pressures operating on them. They don't have a shepherd. This is an assessment of the leaders of Jesus's time and place, that they're not really leaders. They don't actually have the best interests of the people at heart. So that's implicit in this. But also this view of people that they were doing the best they could in the circumstances that they were in. And Jesus was going to, like the first group of assistants, he was going to minister to them. He was going to support them so that they could succeed, so that they could come into their own, so they could reach their full potential. That's how I see what it means for Jesus to see the crowds in this way. So then Jesus said to the disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." Now, I did a little reading, some Bible commentaries before this, and what they noted about this verse was that, basically Jesus is saying that there's lots of work to do, but not a lot of people to do the work, and that work is this kind of missionary work of ministering to people, of providing for people what they need, and providing leadership. That is not an occasion for despair, though, for Jesus. He just turns to prayer. Jesus is modeling reliance on God, and again, there's no blame in this statement. It's a description of what is. It's just Jesus is noticing reality, turning to God in prayer to meet the need. And the need is for more people to help in this work. And then in the very next verse, it's almost as Jesus acts as if he is an answer to the prayer, or he has the capacity to answer the prayer. Because then he gathers, let's just read it. So Jesus summoned his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and to cure every sickness. So what Jesus does next is what he asked God to do for the world, for others. He goes about multiplying the laborers by sort of deputizing, commissioning these disciples to do exactly what Jesus had done before. I mean, notice this list. It echoes the list from verse 35 in chapter 9. Unclean spirits, casting them out, curing every disease and sickness. The only thing that's left out here is teaching in synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom. But hold on to that. That'll come later. So there's this. There's almost like an apprenticeship kind of thing that the Gospel of Matthew shows us, is that the disciples do exactly what Jesus did, and they were along for the ride for what Jesus was doing before, and so they have been apprenticed into this ministry. There's not really classes; it's kind of an on-the-job type training situation. And so here's the names. Here are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, also known as Peter. Now, the order matters here. There's a kind of a greater honor. Not that Simon Peter is elevated as better than the others, but there is an acknowledgement here of Peter's leadership. Okay. And Peter's brother Andrew, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James, son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanian, and Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed him. So Judas is at the end, and named as the one who betrays Jesus, and so there's a lesser honor, and so there's why the order of this list of names matters. Simon the Canaanian, he's actually a zealot, perhaps, or it could just mean the Canaanian doesn't mean that he's from Canaan or from Cana. It means that he may have been zealous, more zealous than the others. Or it could be Matthew, probably not, maybe referring to the zealots who were insurrectionists, who were, fomenting an armed rebellion against Rome. We don't know. Okay. So these Jesus sent out with the following instructions. And again, it's Jesus here. Jesus is taking the initiative. He summons the 12, he gathers the 12, and then he sends the 12 to do exactly what he had done before. So the initiative is Jesus's, and the kind of the mission, their mission is Jesus's mission, that they're inheriting everything from Jesus, including authority. Okay, so go nowhere among the Gentiles and enter no town of the Samaritans, but rather go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So there's that idea of sheep being repeated. Jesus had seen the crowds as like sheep without a shepherd. And so Jesus sends these disciples like shepherds for the sheep. Now, this verse has been misunderstood. This is not about prejudice. It is instead, it's about the immediate needs of Israel. It's also perhaps maybe capturing some of the historical reality of how this mission unfolded. Everything starts somewhere, and this mission started in Israel. Even in Luke, Jesus sends the disciples in Luke and Acts to Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. So there's almost like some people interpret that as three stages, because historically that were the three stages. It was Israel, then it was Samaria, then it was beyond that. So this could be also capturing some of just the historical reality about how this mission moved on the geography of the planet. It is not about a rejection of Gentiles or Samaritans. So, then Jesus says, as you go, proclaim the good news. The kingdom of heaven is come near. All right, so Jesus is not omitting that proclamation, which Jesus was all about, as we saw in verse 35, chapter 9. It just wasn't mentioned for whatever reason in that list earlier. But these words are Jesus' exact words. The kingdom of heaven has come near. So it's an invitation. Let my words be your words. Let my teaching be your teaching, is what Jesus is saying to the disciples. That's the message that they are to carry, along with these actions. So notice there's words and actions that go together, both in Jesus' ministry and in now the disciples' ministry. Cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons. These are the very things that Jesus was doing. Earlier, cure the sick, that's been happening all along. Earlier in chapter 9, Jesus raised a young girl from the dead. He's been cleansing lepers and casting out demons. All of this is imitation of Jesus. Do what I did. As you saw me do, now you go and do. Okay? And the final sentence here, you received without payment. Give without payment. So that is, they are not to be charging for their services. They are giving for free. You could call this free healthcare if you want. But the idea is it's just given away. Nobody has to prove how harassed and helpless they are. Nobody has to prove that they really are a needy case. Nobody has to show that they're not on drugs or not. In fact, Jesus includes people who are, sex workers and all kinds of other folks who were considered criminals. So this just everybody. And just as you received without payment, give without payment. So this really gives an invitation to what our ministry gets to be all about, both on the individual level and on the collective level. And even what comes before that, I think, is how do we see the people around us, our neighbors individually and as a group? How do you see the protesters? How do you see, fill in the blank? How do you see people? And the way Jesus saw them is the precursor for how Jesus responded to them with compassion. And so perhaps our prayer can be, Lord, open our eyes to see the people around us the way you see them. and trust that based on that new vision, our commission from Jesus will come. Yeah, we can pray, Jesus, gather us, commission us, give us what we need, and send us out. Let us look to you, O Lord, for what we should be doing in this time place under these circumstances. So rather than be in despair or be overwhelmed and do nothing, yeah, turn to God in prayer and we'll look at what Jesus did and just do the same. It can be almost as naive as that. Well, thank you for spending a little bit of time with me. I hope that this was enlightening, and I hope that the Lord moves through this time to move all of us into the world with the same compassion that was in Jesus. Bye.